The ASP.NET MVC Core framework is inspired by a design pattern known as Model View Controller, or MVC, which is an architectural strategy used to help structure larger projects to manage their complexity. So let's break that long-worded statement apart so that you understand the implication of this and understand what this design pattern seeks to do and how it seeks to solve that problem. So a design pattern, let's start there. A design pattern is a possible solution to a common problem that many software developers have. They're discussed and refined over time through conferences and through discussions online and so on. And there are dozens of design patterns. They're documented in books and in websites, and you'll come to see that term design pattern used frequently as you continue your career in software development. But you can think of it simply as a possible solution to a common problem that we all face. Okay? And so what is the common problem that we're trying to solve here with this MVC pattern? Well, in large projects you can accumulate a lot of code. In fact, without some way to tame all that complexity, all that code, a project can die under its own weight, meaning that it becomes difficult to make any changes at all because it's difficult to find the code that needs to change for the particular change request that's come from the customer, or whenever you make a change, it could break something else in your code. So one way to manage complexity in a software system is to follow a time-tested software principle which says you should separate code by its concern or its job in the system. This is known as the separation of concerns principle. Okay, so you think of the different jobs that code can have, and you separate the code into a code file based or a component based on its job. And so many architectural design patterns that are available today, MVC, there's MVVM, and there's several others. They all kind of have this fundamental concept at heart, this principle at heart, to separate out the concerns. Model View Controller is a pattern that seeks to provide guidance by saying that there are three primary concerns within most applications, and this has been applied to the web, but it was developed way before web development was even something that was conceived of way back in the 70s. All right, so first of all, you have a model, and the model represents the data that you want to expose to a user. Then there's the view, and the view is the visual or structural presentation logic of that model to the user. And then you have the controller, which is the orchestration logic of matching a model with a view and presenting that to the user. All right, so those are the three basic jobs that MVC will define, and it kind of drives everything else in that design pattern. So ASP.NET MVC Core then utilizes this basic philosophy of how to separate concerns, and it does so using folders and files and certain naming conventions, which we'll come back to. But let's focus back on the pattern in general. Before we leave the MVC pattern and move on to ASP.NET specific implementation of it, I really want you to understand a few nuances about these basic concerns and talk through them. First of all, M is the first letter in MVC, or Model View Controller. It's first. You can think of it in mnemonically, I guess is the word, because it's the primary focus of the MVC pattern. The view and the controller only exist to expose a model to an end user. When I say model, I'm primarily talking about an instance of data that conforms to some structure. So I suppose there are different ways to view what a model really is, and this will have some implications in what we do in the future here. But when I use the term model, I suppose we can talk about it in different ways. If we're talking about how the data is persisted, then I'll probably be talking about a row in a table in a in a relational database, so that it has structure as opposed to NoSQL where there's really no structure. If we're talking about how that data is operated on by business logic, then I'm talking about an instance of a class as that row might be loaded up from the database and into memory, and it's operated on by in perhaps C# or some other programming language. If we're talking about how the data is mapped from the database to an in-memory representation of that data, then we're probably talking about an entity, like how it's mapped in the entity framework, for example. But at the end of the day, those are all different ways of talking about essentially what a model is. We're talking about data in one of its many different forms. And this is important, so we're going to come back to this in another video in this micro course. Now, when I say the job of the view and the controller is to expose the model, that could mean merely presentation. It could mean structure, like in the form of a JSON document or an XML document. But it could also mean operating on the model. So adding or updating or deleting an instance of the model in memory, and then that would filter obviously down to some persistence layer in a database. It also implies that before something is allowed to operate on the model, that some sort of validation has been performed to prevent nonsensical or incomplete representations of that model from being persisted or acted upon. So the view and the controller are the gatekeepers to ensure that the model's validity is preserved, and then to display it or to present it in some way to an end user. Now, when I say the job of the view and the controller is to expose the model to a user or an end user, I'm referring to the actor that requested some interaction with the model. That actor could be a person viewing a web page or some other software system that's retrieving or requesting an update of that model. And so one of the things that we'll learn about ASP.NET MVC Core is that not only does it support as a framework the presentation of a web page, but it also supports the presentation in terms of a web API in the same code base, so that you can have some other software system, not even .NET based. It could be anything that can accept a JSON payload in the response to a web request. And then it can act on that payload in some programmatic way, right? So those are all users of the system. For the most part, in this course, we'll be talking about an end user, like a real person with eyeballs who can actually view a web page in terms of how that exposure of the model will actually happen in a view. But it could mean also exposing it as an endpoint in a web API. Now, finally, I want to say that the controller's primary job is to map a model to a view. However, that's really just a general description of what it's supposed to do. In reality, many developers give the controller much more responsibility in the system and give it the larger task of overall orchestration, not just orchestrating a model with a view, but also tying in the business logic that we're going to apply against the model, tying in persistence, and so on. All these tasks are usually given to the controller, for better or for worse. That's usually, in practical terms, what it means. So when I use the term orchestration, I mean that software unit is in charge of arranging the collaborations between different objects in the system to perform what's called a use case. And a use case is an overloaded term. It can mean many different things. But in this context, I'm referring to a use case as a complete interaction. Think of it as a script between two actors on stage, right? It's a complete interaction between those two actors. So a complete interaction might be something as simple as the following statement. As a user, I want to add a customer record to the system so that we can begin sending customer promotional mailings, all right? So I have a model, a customer, as it's represented in our software system. I have a view, a web-based user interface with HTML form fields that allow some customer service agent or salesperson to capture vital information about the customer that they've been working with over the last weeks or months. And when that HTML form is posted to the web server, the controller has to orchestrate a number of different activities in order for the whole thing to work. So first of all, it's going to need to coordinate with the model binding system of our web application framework to convert that HTTP post message into a series of objects that can be mapped to our model. That's easy. Most of that work's taken care of for us by the framework, but the controller still needs to know that these objects are available to it and what it can do with it. Then it has to coordinate with the validation system of our web application framework to ensure that the data that was entered by that customer representative or salesperson, that they entered the data correctly, that it conforms to the constraints that we've put on the model to ensure that only letters, for example, can be used in the name, and that the address field is filled out, and it's because that's required information. But we want to ensure that the data that has been entered into the system is complete and it meets our standards for high quality. And then that same controller needs to coordinate the business objects in the system containing business rules that are used to determine which type of mailings that we might want to send to that specific customer based on their purchase history. And then the controller will need to orchestrate or coordinate the persistence objects in our software system that contain the logic to persist the customer model to a database in our system. And then finally, there might be some coordination with the routing system of our web application framework to return the user to view a confirmation message of some sort to let them know that this operation completed successfully, or if there were any errors to notify them that, hey, you need to fix these fields of information before they can be saved into our database, right? So there's a lot of orchestration, coordination that needs to happen in order to enable a specific use case inside of our system. So the controller winds up controlling and coordinating other subsystems in the web framework as well as our own business and persistence layer logic. So the MVC design pattern is well-intentioned. The MVC framework is designed to make it easy to follow the pattern and separate your concerns. But even so, if you're not careful, you can begin to munge concerns together, especially with regards to the controller. It can take on too much responsibility in the system. Later on, we'll talk about architecture and how to move some of those responsibilities out of the controller's purview. But in small applications, that's not such a big deal. In larger applications, you really have to put a lot more effort into making sure that you reach the goal of the MVC pattern, which is to separate concerns. Okay? So now with a lot of that background, out of the way, we can move on and start working with the MVC framework beginning in the next video. We'll see you there. Thanks.